Title: 5 creepy Reddit horror stories that will keep you up all night. You're home alone. You hear a noise you just can't explain. A floorboard creaks upstairs when nobody else is there. A whisper right on the edge of your hearing that makes every hair on your body stand on end. You brush it off, right? It's just the house settling. The wind is playing tricks on you. But what if it's not? The 5 stories you're about to hear come from people who experienced exactly that, and a whole lot more. These aren't just spooky campfire dailies. They are harrowing accounts posted online that blur the line between our world and a much darker one. Some are written as fiction, others as terrifyingly true encounters. So, dim the lights. Get comfortable. You might not be sleeping much tonight. Our first story comes from Reddit's nosleep, posted by a user named Family Heirlooms. It's a chilling reminder that some houses don't just hold memories. They hold on to misery. It all started quietly. My sister Ella and I had just moved back into our childhood home after our parents passed away. The house was old, full of all the creaks and groans we'd grown up with. But a new sound started to join the nightly chorus. A faint, rhythmic scratching coming from the basement. At first, we told ourselves it was rats, but the sound was too slow, too methodical, like fingernails dragging across old, splintered wood. The basement had always felt wrong. Our great-aunt, the one no one in the family ever talked about, had spent her last years locked down there, her mind completely gone. The official family story was that she just wasted away. But now, I'm not so sure. The scratching got louder every single night. And then came the whispers. At first, they were just faint mumbles you could barely hear through the basement door. But soon, they got clearer. It was a woman's voice, and it was pleading. Ella was the one who really started to unravel. She had these horrible nightmares, waking up screaming that a woman was standing at the foot of her bed. She described her as gaunt, with hollow eyes just filled with this ancient rage. I tried to be the rational one, but it was getting hard to ignore the cold spots that drifted through the hallways, or the fact that the basement door would be cracked open in the morning, even when we knew we had locked it. It all came to a head one Tuesday night. The scratching was frantic loud, right beneath the living room floorboards, and it was mixed with this guttural sobbing that just shook us to our bones. We huddled together on the couch, completely terrified. Then, all at once, every light in the house blew out, throwing us into pitch-black darkness. The scratching stopped, the sobbing stopped, and the silence that followed was somehow a million times worse. We didn't sleep. We just sat there, waiting for the sun to come up. The next morning, we packed our bags and we never looked back. We sold the house for a fraction of what it was worth, without telling the new owners why. I still have nightmares about that scratching and the hollow eyes Ella saw. I know what was in that basement. It was all the pain of a forgotten soul, and it wanted us to feel it too. This next story was posted to our Let's Not Meet, a place where people share true, bone-chilling encounters with strangers they pray they'll never see again. This is what happens when the peaceful isolation of nature turns into a trap. A user called Solo Hiker 88 went on a weekend camping trip alone. It was something they did all the time to just get away from the city noise and find some peace. The campsite was remote, deep in a national forest, and the first day was absolute bliss. But as darkness fell on the second night, a feeling of deep unease started to settle in. It began with the sound of twigs snapping just outside the ring of firelight. An animal, they thought. A deer, maybe. But the sounds didn't just pass by. They seemed to be circling the camp, staying just out of sight. The rustling in the tall grass was deliberate, and it was making a clear loop around their tent. Frozen with fear, the hiker just listened as the sound stopped right in front of their tent flap. A single thin layer of nylon was all that separated them from whatever, or whoever, was out there. After a minute that felt like an hour, the rustling moved off toward the trees. Mustering up every ounce of courage they had, the hiker peeked through the tent's small mesh window, and in the pale moonlight, they saw it, a tall, human-shaped silhouette, standing perfectly still at the edge of the woods, just watching the tent. They ducked back inside, their heart pounding. Sleep was obviously out of the question. For hours, they just sat in the dark, clutching a survival knife, listening to the footsteps of someone walking the perimeter of their camp, over and over again. Just before dawn, a new sound, a slow, quiet unzipping. It was coming from their own tent. A hand started to poke through the opening when suddenly, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the morning air. It wasn't the intruder. It came from another tent, further down a clearing the hiker hadn't even noticed. Lights flashed on from other tents as a dark figure was seen sprinting away into the forest. It turned out a Boy Scout troop was camping nearby, and the intruder had tried to get into one of their tents. No one got a good look at his face. They packed up and left immediately, warning the park ranger on the way out. The person was never caught. The hiker wrote that they never went camping alone again. The silence of the woods doesn't feel peaceful anymore. It feels like it's watching. Our third story pulls us back to nosleep and the world of the truly uncanny. It was posted by a high school teacher, Mr_Thompson_tells, and it brings up a terrifying question. What happens when you can't trust your own eyes in a place you know like the back of your hand? It all started with a simple mistake. At the end of a long Tuesday, he was grading pop quizzes. He had 21 students in his third period history class. He knew that for a fact. But he was holding 22 papers. The handwriting on the last one was neat, almost unnaturally perfect, but the name at the top, Alice, wasn't on his roster. His first thought? A prank. Some kid from another class must have slipped it in the pile. He tossed it and didn't think about it again. But the next day, while taking attendance, he counted 22 heads. There, in the back corner of the classroom, sat a small, quiet girl with long dark hair that covered her face. He didn't recognize her at all. When he called the names from his roster, no one answered for Alice. When he looked back at the corner, the chair was empty. This started happening all the time. He'd catch glimpses of her, a flash of dark hair in a crowded hall, a small shape sitting alone in the cafeteria, a face in the window of his classroom long after school was out. Every single time he tried to get a better look, she'd just vanish. No other student, no other teacher ever seemed to see her. He started to think he was losing his mind. Was he just overworked? Hallucinating? One evening, he was working late, and a sudden, sharp cold filled the room. He looked up, and she was standing in the doorway. This time, she didn't disappear. She just stood there, her face hidden by her hair, one pale hand gripping the doorframe. A voice whispered, even though her lips didn't move, "You're not supposed to see me." The teacher ran out of that school, left his coat and briefcase behind, and requested a transfer the very next day. He never found out who or what Alice was. A ghost? A figment of his imagination? Or something else entirely? A student who had somehow slipped through the very cracks of reality. He had no desire to find out. There's something deeply unsettling about a workplace after hours. The empty desks, the low hum of machines, the dead silence where there's usually noise. This story, adapted from a nosleep concept, feels like it could be a true crime case from Let's Not Meet. A user named Nightwatcher_Dave wrote about his job as a security guard at a massive, sprawling warehouse. It was a lonely gig, mostly just walking his rounds and watching monitors. For the most part, it was boring, until people started to disappear. The first was a cleaner named Maria, a reliable single mom who'd worked there for years. One night, she just never clocked out. Her cleaning cart was found abandoned in a long concrete hallway. Beside it, a half-empty spray bottle and a rag on the floor. The security footage for that hallway? Inexplicably corrupted for a 2-hour window. The police investigated, but with no body and no evidence, she was just a missing person. A few months later, a forklift operator on the late shift, a guy named Ben, he radioed in that he was going to the far side of the warehouse to get a pallet. He never radioed back. They found his forklift, engine still humming, in aisle 37. Ben was gone. And once again, the security camera for that specific aisle had malfunctioned. A thick paranoia started to spread through the small night crew. They started working in pairs, using a buddy system, never going anywhere alone. Management even brought in specialists to completely overhaul the security system, but the damage was done. The warehouse didn't feel like a boring job anymore. It felt like a predator, a concrete maze that sometimes just decided to eat someone. The user said he quit after the third disappearance. It was a young guy on his own security team. They'd spoken at the start of the shift. 2 hours later, his patrol radio went dead. All they found was his flashlight on the floor in the deepest part of the sub-basement. Its beam was still on, pointing right at a solid concrete wall. That was it. No struggle, no note, nothing. Just another person blinked out of existence. The user ended his post with a thought that is almost worse than a ghost story. He doesn't think it was anything supernatural. He believes something or someone is still living in the vast, dark corners of that warehouse, watching and waiting. Our final story for tonight comes from nosleep, a terrifying tale from a user named Curse James. It's about a slumber party, an old board game, and a night that turned into a living nightmare. It's proof that some games should never, ever be played. It was an end-of-summer sleepover. The user and her 2 friends, Margot and Jenny, were poking around in the attic when they found a dusty old board game called Mystery Man. None of them had ever seen it before. The box was plain black, and the rules were simple. Roll the dice, move your piece, and draw cards that give you clues about your own personal mystery man. To win, you had to collect all 6 clue cards that described him, his height, hair color, clothes, and his weapon before his game piece caught up to yours. The first couple of rounds were just fun. Jenny's mystery man had a goofy mustache. Margot's wore a green hat. But then the game changed. One card told them to call a phone number printed on it. Margot nervously dialed, put it on speaker, and a distorted, raspy voice answered. "The mystery man is walking down your street," it grated, and the line went dead. They all shared a nervous laugh. Then Jenny drew a card. Her clue was a long, sharp knife. The second she read it aloud, they heard a loud crash from downstairs in the kitchen. They ran down to find a butcher knife on the tile floor, a knife that had been in the wooden block just moments before. The panic started to really set in. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was the user's turn. She drew a card. It said, "He is inside the house." At that exact moment, the landline rang. Shaking, she answered it. It was the same distorted voice. "You have discovered your mystery man, Heather. You are safe ... for now." The game wasn't creating a fictional stalker. It was describing a real one. They were trapped, slaves to the rules. They had to keep playing to try and banish their pursuer before he found them. Margot managed to get all her clues, and her piece was removed from the board. But then Jenny failed. Her stalker's piece landed on her space, and as it did, her bedroom door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was a tall man in a wide-brimmed hat, holding a long, sharp knife. The story just cuts off right there, leaving us with that terrifying image of the game bleeding into reality. The line between fiction and a real story on the internet can be incredibly thin. These accounts, whether they're born from a writer's twisted imagination on nosleep or from a genuinely terrifying experience on Let's Not Meet, They all tap into our most basic fears. The fear of being watched, of the familiar becoming strange, and of realizing you are not in control. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. If you have your own scary story you want to share, I would love to read it. Leave it in the comments below. I really do read all of them. And if you want more collections of horrors like this one, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next. The world is full of unexplained sounds and shadows you swear you saw in the corner of your eye. Most of the time, you're right, it's nothing. But as these stories prove, sometimes it's everything. So tonight, when you turn off the lights and you're all alone in the quiet of your room, try not to think about what could be hiding just beyond your line of sight. Sleep well, I hope. 3 true Reddit scary stories. While camping, there's a kind of peace you can only find when you're deep in the woods, miles from anything. The air just feels cleaner, the stars look brighter, and the silence is a real escape from all the noise of daily life. For most campers, that feeling, the crackling fire, the canopy of stars, that's what it's all about. But what happens when that silence gets broken by something that doesn't belong? When the comforting darkness of the forest starts hiding something terrifying? Suddenly, that peaceful isolation can turn into pure vulnerability. These 3 stories were sent in anonymously on Reddit. They come from people who went into the woods looking for an escape, but found something else entirely chilling. Unexplainable events that will make you think twice about ever sleeping outside again. Section 1. Midnight Intruders in the Wilderness. So our first story is about 2 friends, both seasoned campers, who loved finding the most remote spots they possibly could. For them, camping was more than a hobby. It was a ritual. They'd spend weeks looking over maps, searching for that perfect, untouched piece of wilderness, far away from any trail or campground. On this trip, they found a real gem, a small clearing deep inside a national forest, hours from the nearest town. The only way in was a trail that barely existed before it just faded into nothing, leaving them completely surrounded by the woods. The first day was perfect. They set up their tents, gathered firewood, and cooked dinner over the fire. As the sun went down, the forest came alive with the usual sounds of crickets and little animals rustling around. It was exactly the symphony of the wild they'd come for. By midnight, the fire had burned down to glowing embers, and a deep quiet settled over their camp. They were wiped out from the hike and fell asleep fast. It was just after 2 in the morning when a sound that was completely out of place cut through the calm. It was the faint sound of voices. At first, it was easy to just brush it off. Maybe it was the wind, or their minds playing tricks on them in that hazy state between sleep and being awake. But the sound didn't stop. It was low, hard to make out, and it was coming from the direction of the trail they'd used to hike in. One of the friends, we'll call him Mark, slowly unzipped his tent, trying not to make a sound. He looked across the clearing and saw his friend Ben, already peeking out of his own tent, his eyes wide in the moonlight. These voices weren't just passing by, like you'd expect from hikers who were out late. They were just lingering, hovering right at the edge of their camp. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this hour? A knot of dread started to tighten in Mark's stomach. Ben put a finger to his lips for silence, then pointed toward the trail. And then the voices just stopped. The silence that came next was somehow heavier and more menacing than before. It was replaced by the soft crunch of footsteps on dry leaves, getting steadily louder. They were coming closer. Mark's heart was hammering against his ribs. He just watched, completely frozen, as 4 dark figures stepped out from the trees, moving silently and deliberately right toward their camp. They weren't using any flashlights or headlamps, just the dim moonlight to see. That was a clear sign they didn't want to be seen. Outnumbered, with nowhere to run, a primal fear just took over. Mark scrambled back inside his tent, his hands fumbling for the big survival knife he always kept nearby. Ben did the same. The four strangers walked into the campsite and just stood there, four ominous silhouettes against the dark woods. It was a terrifying, silent standoff. They were just watching. After a moment that felt like it stretched on forever, Ben made a move. He flicked on his high-powered flashlight and aimed the beam right at them. The sudden light revealed four men. They looked gaunt and were dressed in worn-out clothes. One of them, a tall, wiry man who looked like the leader, shielded his eyes and said in a gravelly voice, "Turn that off." It wasn't a request, it was a demand. Ben kept the light on them. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice trembling but trying to sound firm. The man took a step closer. "We need food," he said, his eyes scanning their campsite, stopping on their coolers and supplies. Mark and Ben were in an impossible spot. They were isolated, miles from any kind of help, and facing four desperate men. They had food for their trip, but not a lot to spare. Reluctantly, they handed some of it over bread, canned goods, whatever they could grab easily. The men took it all without a word of thanks, their eyes still cold and impossible to read. Then, just as silently as they showed up, they turned around and melted back into the forest. The two friends spent the rest of the night wide awake, sitting back to back with their knives out, listening to every single snap of a twig. The peace they'd come for was completely shattered, replaced by the chilling knowledge of just how vulnerable they really were. They never found out who those men were, or what might have happened if they'd said no. The woods didn't feel like an escape anymore. They felt like a place where the darkness could be hiding anything. Section 2, The Man Across the Lake. There's a special kind of dread that creeps in when you realize you're being watched. This next story is from a couple who were looking for some quiet time at a remote lakeside campsite, only to find themselves the target of a stranger's unnerving attention. The spot itself was perfect. A small, secluded patch of ground on the shore of a huge glassy lake, surrounded by a thick wall of pine trees. It was late in the season, so they had the whole place to themselves. As the sun went down, they built a big campfire, its light dancing across the water. It was peaceful, romantic, exactly what they'd been hoping for. As the night got deeper, the fire was their only light, just a warm orange bubble in an ocean of black. And that's when one of them noticed it, a tiny pinprick of light from the opposite shore, hundreds of yards away. At first, they figured it might be another camper, but the light was acting weird. It would flash on, point right at their campfire for a few seconds, and then just click off. They tried to ignore it, telling themselves it was just their imagination running wild in the dark. But a few minutes later, it happened again. A beam of light shot across the lake, landing precisely on their campsite before it disappeared. This time, a real chill went up their spines. This wasn't random. Somebody was over there, and they knew they were being watched. They kept their voices low, trying to figure out what to do. Should they shout something? Pack up and leave in the middle of the night? The lake was wide, but the feeling of being targeted was just deeply unsettling. As they were trying to decide, the flashlight started to move. It wasn't in one place anymore. It was slowly, methodically, moving along the shoreline. It was making its way around the lake, toward them. With every flash of light, the source was getting closer. They could now vaguely make out a single figure navigating the dense woods that lined the lake, always keeping his light trained on them, like a predator tracking its prey. Real panic started to kick in. They were in the middle of nowhere, with zero cell service and no one else for miles. Then the light vanished. For several tense minutes, there was nothing but the crackle of their own fire and complete darkness. They had no idea if he'd given up, if he was hiding, or if he was now using the dark to sneak up on their camp. They couldn't take that chance. In a hushed panic, they made a split-second decision. They kicked dirt over the fire to kill the flames, grabbed only the absolute essentials, keys, wallets, and phones and left everything else behind. They scrambled back to their car in the pitch black, fumbling for the doors, just praying the engine would start. As they sped away down the long dirt road, they glanced back toward the lake. They couldn't see the man, but they could feel his presence in the oppressive dark. They drove until they hit a town with a police station and reported what happened. A ranger went to check it out the next day, but their campsite was exactly as they'd left it. There was no sign of the man and no explanation for what he was doing. They never found out who he was or what he wanted, but that memory of a single light systematically closing in on them in the dead of night was a horror they would never forget. Section 3. The Knife-Wielding Stranger. This last story is a straight-up terrifying reminder that the most dangerous predators in the woods don't always have four legs. This one comes from a father who took his family camping for a weekend getaway near a coastal beach. The campsite was a popular spot, but they had gotten there late on a Friday night. It was pretty quiet, with just a few other families scattered around. They set up their big tent, got a small fire going, and settled in to enjoy the sound of the ocean waves nearby. The kids were having a blast roasting marshmallows, and the parents were finally relaxing. The whole vibe was peaceful and safe. That sense of security was completely shattered around. 11 p.m. headlights cut through the darkness as a beat-up car pulled onto the dirt track leading into the campground. It drove slowly, way too slowly, before stopping near their sight. A man got out and started walking toward them. He was staggering, and at first, the father just assumed he was drunk and lost. He stood up, ready to point him in the right direction. But as the man got closer, lit up by the flickering campfire, the father's blood ran cold. The man was holding a large knife. This wasn't some little pocket knife or a camping tool. It was a long, menacing blade, and he was holding it loosely at his side. "You can't be here," the stranger slurred, his voice thick and aggressive. The father immediately moved, so he was standing between the man and his family, who were now huddled by the tent, their faces pale with fear. He tried to keep his voice as calm and non-confrontational as possible. "No problem," he said, holding his hands up like he was surrendering. "We didn't realize. We can pack up and leave." But this just seemed to make the man even more agitated. "No, you can't camp here," he shouted, getting more and more erratic. He took another stumbling step forward, the knife glinting in the firelight. This was escalating with terrifying speed. The father knew that one wrong move, one hint of aggression, could end in tragedy. His mind was racing, trying to calculate the distance to his car, wondering if his family could even make a run for it. He held his ground, just continuing to speak in that same steady, reassuring voice, telling the man they understood and that they would go. For what felt like an eternity, the two men were locked in this tense standoff. The stranger seemed to be fighting with his own unstable thoughts, his eyes darting between the father and the fire. Finally, after a few more moments of charged silence, the man's agitation seemed to fade a little. He mumbled something they couldn't understand, turned around, and staggered back to his car. He got in, and a moment later sped off, his tires kicking up dirt and gravel. The family just stood there, frozen, hearts pounding, listening until the sound of his engine was completely gone. The peace of the night was destroyed, replaced by a raw, lingering fear. They didn't sleep at all. As soon as the first light of dawn hit the horizon, they packed everything up in the dark and left. The whole thing only lasted a few minutes, but it was a horrifying glimpse into how fast a peaceful family trip can turn into a life or death situation because of one unstable stranger. Conclusion: the woods have a certain magic to them, but they also keep secrets. For every perfect night spent under the stars, there's a story like one of these floating around, a chilling reminder that when you go out into the wild, you're stepping into a world with its own set of rules. The very isolation you might be looking for can also be your biggest weakness. If you have a true scary story of your own, I'd honestly love to hear it. You can send it to the email address in the description below. For more tales of unexplained encounters and chilling true stories, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next. Stay safe out there.